Let's start with an innocent question. Why do you think there are sales? Nowadays, winter sales, summer sales, and a number of smaller events in between are an institution, especially in fashion. They represent a tremendous display of energy, organization, and marketing. But why do they exist in the first place? They exist to allow retailers to get rid of overstock. As simple as that. In the first place, sales are the manifestation of a forecast gone wrong. It can be argued that today they are much more than that. True, but still the initial goal remains. We can also add that by taking a look at the kind of sales that a retailer practices, we can have a decent idea of the forecasting accuracy of that specific retailer. And when some retailers need to reach a point where for every item bought they offer two, and that's not fiction, it really means that there is possibly room for improvement in the forecasting department. Now, granted, the exercise is not an easy one. To be fair, it is particularly tough in fashion. Forecasting demand in fashion has been elusive for decades, and most practitioners are still relying on guesswork. Still, over the last 2 decades, statistics with machine learning and computer power with the cloud have been evolving at high speed. What was pure fiction yesterday in terms of forecasts is now within our reach. I believe there are new ways of capturing more information about the future, and new ways of making better decisions for supply chains based on this information. And this relies extensively on the notion of probabilistic forecasts. That's the reason why I'm here today, to show you that thanks to those probabilistic forecasts, we can improve supply chain performance and save the elephants. Seriously. The Elephant Pants is a client of LOCAD who benefits from our probabilistic forecasting technology. They are a very cool U.S. brand. Not only do they have cool pants, they also donate part of their revenue to wildlife preservation. Like most fashion brands, they face multiple supply chain challenges. For every new collection being launched, they need to know months in advance the market demand in order to produce and buy just the quantities they need. Too little stock, and they face stockouts with nothing to sell. Too much stock, and they end up with overstocks and dead inventory. The Elephant Pants has been a client of LOCAD for a while now. Their supply chain is now optimized through probabilistic forecasts computed by LOCAD, and we support their daily supply chain decisions. David Chakran, co-founder of the Elephant Pants, has kindly allowed us to disclose in this talk some of the secret ingredients behind the success of the Elephant Pants, despite the fact that I refused his most kind offer to come up on stage with pants that he would have handpicked for me. Now, let's review the challenges for the supply chain of the Elephant Pants, with a specific interest on inventory optimization. First, we need to forecast the lead time. The lead time is the delay for goods that are produced in, say, Thailand to land in the USA. Because we haven't invented teleportation yet, that takes weeks. Moreover, because of events such as the Chinese New Year, lead times are longer at certain times of the year. Thus, lead times exhibit all sorts of statistical patterns that can be captured by a proper statistical analysis. Then, we need to forecast the demand. Here, the main challenge is collections. That is, waves of new products that have never been sold before. However, the future demand is coupled with the lead time. Indeed, if there are 3 months of lead time to get the goods manufactured in Thailand to arrive in the USA, then the inventory needs to cover 3 months' worth of demand. The longer the lead time, the more future demand needs to be covered. Finally, we need to compose a purchasing or manufacturing order. This represents the exact quantities, product by product, that the Elephant Pants is ordering from its own suppliers. From afar, it could seem that the Elephant Pants could order just enough to cover the expected future demand. However, this would not take into account the ordering constraints. Indeed, there are manufacturing constraints and transportation constraints. Take minimum order quantities, for instance. Your supplier in China seldom lets you buy the products one by one. With these constraints in mind, let's get back to the bigger picture. The supply chain of the Elephant Pants basically needs to balance 2 risks: stockouts, which are generated by unexpectedly high demand, and overstocks, which are generated by unexpectedly low demand. When the future demand is roughly aligned with the forecast, it's okay. The inventory rotates just fine. Thus, the supply chain costs are in fact concentrated on the extremes, that is, the statistical extremes, the not-so-likely scenarios when things go wrong. At a fundamental level, it's precisely because the supply chain costs are concentrated at the extremes that probabilistic forecasts are so important. It's because they tell us about the probabilities of those not-so-likely scenarios. And that is exactly where the traditional approach on forecasting usually fails. First, let's clarify a common misconception about forecasting. When people think of time series forecasting, they typically think of a gentle, smooth time series like the one we have on the left. Yet this vision is vastly incorrect. Market demands are much more erratic. The demand history tends to be much more spiky. In turn, this misconception generates another misconception about the forecasts themselves. The most widespread type of forecast is the median periodic forecast, with the period being either a day, a week, or a month. That's what we can call the traditional forecast. You can add a whole lot of fancy mathematical models on top, but the basic stays the same. Here, this is the graph on the left. Median refers to the intent of computing a number that has a 50% chance to be above or below future demand. In contrast, the probabilistic forecast is a distribution of probabilities. All demand levels are possible, just not equally probable. This is the graph on the right. The distribution of probabilities is visualized as an histogram, and under the hood, the probabilistic demand forecast is built on top of a probabilistic lead time forecast. But we won't have the time to cover the fine print. Median forecasts are appealing because they're very easy to understand, and they seem to perfectly capture the future demand. Yet this is just fantasy. They are usually very wrong, especially when it comes to fashion. Why? Because the demand is very erratic. There is no hope to compute one demand value per day with any meaningful degree of accuracy. Remember that the graph on the left is completely non-representative of real demand time series, especially in fashion. The probabilistic forecasts, on the other hand, are much less intuitive. Yet at the same time, those probabilistic forecasts tell us a lot more about the future demand. Instead of having a single value that is supposed to be the correct one, we have all the future scenarios. You can think of probabilistic forecasts as an extension of the what-if scenarios, except that you are looking at all scenarios at once, instead of cherry-picking a handful of them. From a business perspective, probabilistic forecasts carry vastly more information about the future demand than classic forecasts. Their superiority lies not in the fact that they are more accurate per se. That superiority lies in the fact that they are richer. Probabilistic forecasts tell you a lot more about the future than classic forecasts ever will. Why is it so essential when it comes to fashion? Simply because fashion demand is driven by novelty. We need to forecast new products, but those products have no sales history yet, and it's impossible to forecast without data. Most software solutions try to solve this challenge by requiring the supply chain staff to manually create pairs of products. However, this works poorly because manual matches are not only tedious, they also misrepresent the new collection, where new products don't have exact one-by-one counterparts with products of the previous collection. Fortunately, this action is not needed where probabilistic forecasts are concerned. From a pure statistical perspective, probabilistic forecasts are much harder to produce than classic forecasts. Indeed, as the probability distribution of the demand carries a lot more information about the future demand compared to median forecasts, it requires a much more in-depth analysis of the historical data. Thus, as far as probabilistic forecasts are concerned, one-by-one mapping between the old and new products would not bring enough information to really make a difference. We need to go further, but the good news is that going further does not require such a tedious manual intervention. Instead, at LOCAD, the forecasting engine extensively leverages the attributes of the products. The good news is that in fashion, there are tons of attributes readily available to qualify the products. We don't need to manually create pairs of products. We just need a forecasting engine that is smart enough to automatically take advantage of all those attributes that already decorate the products. Type of cloth, color, fabric, whatever you have available. Through machine learning algorithms, the forecasting engine is discovering the correlations that exist between the products. Instead of desperately trying to generate a forecast out of a single product that does not carry enough data, the forecasting engine leverages all the information that is available on the other products. Fortunately, fashion brands are producing hundreds or thousands of new products per collection. Hence, we have tons of data points to leverage in order to establish accurate probable forecasts of the future demand. This is exactly what we are doing for elephant pants to forecast the demand for new products. At this point, we have composed our forecasts. We have lead time forecasts and demand forecasts. Those forecasts are designed to take into account the specificities of fashion, and they take the form of distributions of probabilities. However, supply chain practitioners expect to be able to perform operations on their forecasts, to sum forecasts, to stretch them, and so on and so forth. When forecasts are just plain numbers, such as the total demand per week, the four elementary operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, are enough. However, as soon as you are dealing with distributions of probabilities, not so much. Those four elementary operations need to be upgraded to their probabilistic counterpart. The equation displayed here is a convolution, which is a probabilistic equivalence of the sum operation, not on numbers, but on distribution of probabilities. Thus, in order to make the most of the probabilistic forecasts that have been generated, a whole algebra of distributions is needed. It's thanks to this algebra that it becomes possible to compute the expected ROI if one extra unit of stock is purchased, taking as input the probabilistic demand forecast and the relevant economic variables, cost of stock or expected margin, for example. With this algebra of distributions, we can compute the ROI for every unit of stock to be purchased. However, as we said before, it is not always possible to buy a single stock unit. That's where ordering constraints come into play. Back to the elephants then. The elephant pants needs to decide what they will produce and what they will order. To do so, they need to take into account multiple ordering constraints. First of all, there are minimum order quantities. Yet, because it's fashion, it's not just a minimum number of units per product, it's a minimum number of meters of fabric, each product having its own consumption of fabric. Then there are also the sewing minutes to be considered. Dealing with those constraints is already quite a puzzle. Secondly, as we are importing from Thailand, goods are shipped through containers. Thus, we want to fill full containers in order to optimize the transportation costs. We had lower bound nonlinear constraints, and now we add upper bound nonlinear constraints. The puzzle is getting seriously complicated. Lastly, as we have minimum order quantities coupled with full containers, the elephant pants can't order as frequently as they would like to. There is a minimal delay between two successive purchase orders. This delay is imposed by the economic constraints of production and transport. It is referred to as the ordering lead time. However, as we introduce a new lead time, we modify the applicable horizon for the demand forecast. Remember that the demand forecast depends on the horizon that elephant pants seeks to cover. Yet the ordering delay is also varying and dependent on an uncertain demand. At this point, the puzzle is quite akin to the master ghost cube, which is arguably the most nightmarish one. The good news is that probabilistic forecasts are a very good fit. Indeed, without getting into the details, with probabilistic forecasts, it is possible to simulate every possible ordering decision and compute the economic returns associated to this decision. Then it's a pure matter of extensive numerical optimization. At LOCAD, we believe that leveraging probabilistic forecasts is a game changer for supply chains. However, you need to keep in mind that it is not just a switch from one mathematical model to another. You need a big data platform to prepare all the relevant data and make it accessible. You need a probabilistic forecasting engine that generates all the distribution of probabilities in a highly roboticized fashion. You also need an algebra of distributions to make economic calculations that are aligned with the business. Then you need numerical solvers for nonlinear equations, because that's what it takes to cope with minimum order quantities. Finally, you need layers of reporting and data visualization, because well-run companies don't want to treat their supply chain as a black box. Those elements are complex and hard to come by, but once you put them all together, you can make a real difference, and that's exactly what we're doing at LOCAD. Thank you for your attention.